When Dr. Marcus Johnson stopped by Riverside Market after performing life-saving surgery, he didn't expect to become the catalyst for a community's transformation. A routine grocery run turns into a powder keg of racial tension when a store manager's prejudice collides with a respected surgeon's dignity. But what unfolds next doesn't just make headlines. It forces an affluent suburb to confront its demons and redefine justice in unexpected ways. Marcus Johnson pulled his forest green Tesla into the parking spot outside Riverside Market, a high-end grocery store in the affluent suburb of Millbrook Heights. As the director of pediatric surgery at Central Memorial Hospital, he'd just finished a grueling 12-hour shift, saving a young boy's life. All he wanted was to pick up some groceries and head home to his wife and daughters. The automatic doors slid open, releasing a burst of air-conditioned comfort into the humid summer evening. Marcus grabbed a shopping cart, his hospital ID still clipped to his wrinkled blue dress shirt. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he navigated the pristine aisles, selecting organic produce and grass-fed meats for the week ahead. He was examining a package of heirloom tomatoes when he first noticed her watching. Karen Matthews, the store manager, had been trailing him for the past 10 minutes, pretending to reorganize shelves that were already perfectly arranged. Every time Marcus looked up, she quickly averted her gaze and shifted to another aisle, only to reappear moments later. Marcus was used to this dance. After 15 years as one of the few black doctors in Millbrook Heights, he'd developed a thick skin and a practiced patience for such microaggressions. Still, something about Karen's behavior seemed more aggressive than usual. She wasn't even trying to be subtle anymore, standing at the end of each aisle with her arms crossed, walkie-talkie in hand. When Marcus reached the wine section and placed a bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon in his cart, Karen's voice crackled over the store's PA system. "Security to aisle 7. Security to aisle 7. Two young security guards appeared within minutes, looking uncomfortable as Karen pointed at Marcus and whispered urgently to them. Marcus continued shopping, determined not to let this familiar scenario ruin his evening. He'd done nothing wrong, and he refused to be intimidated in a store where he'd been a regular customer for over a decade. At the checkout counter, Marcus placed his items on the conveyor belt: organic vegetables, free-range chicken, whole grain bread, and the bottle of wine. The young cashier, Sarah, greeted him with a warm smile. She'd been working there for years and knew him well. "Good evening, Dr. Johnson. How's little Tommy doing after the surgery?" Sarah asked, scanning his items. Before Marcus could respond, Karen Matthews marched over, her face flushed with what appeared to be a mixture of authority and anxiety. "I'm going to need to see some ID for that wine purchase," she announced loudly, despite the fact that Marcus was clearly in his 40s. "Of course," Marcus replied calmly, reaching for his wallet. "Though I must say, Karen, I've been shopping here for 12 years, and this is the first time you've asked." As he pulled out his driver's license, Karen snatched it from his hand before he could even show it to Sarah. She scrutinized it under the light, turning it over multiple times as if expecting to find evidence of forgery. "This could be fake," she declared, her voice carrying across the store. "I'm going to have to call the police to verify this." The other customers in line began to shift uncomfortably. Sarah's hands froze over the register, her eyes widening in disbelief. Marcus felt his heart rate increase, not from fear, but from a deep, weary anger. He'd been here before, not in this store, but in this situation. The constant need to prove his legitimacy, his right to exist in spaces where some people believed he didn't belong. "Karen," he said, his voice steady and professional, the same tone he used when explaining complicated procedures to anxious parents. "I'm Dr. Marcus Johnson. I've been shopping here since you started as an assistant manager. I just finished performing emergency surgery on an 8-year-old boy. I'm simply trying to buy groceries for my family." But Karen was already on her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she dialed 911. "Yes, I need police assistance at Riverside Market," she spoke into the phone. "We have a suspicious individual attempting to make purchases with what I believe to be false identification." The store had grown quiet. Other customers had stopped their shopping to watch the scene unfold. Some had their phones out, recording. Sarah, the cashier, looked close to tears. A young white woman in line behind Marcus stepped forward. "This is ridiculous," she said. "I'm a nurse at Central Memorial. That's Dr. Johnson. He's the head of pediatric surgery." But Karen waved her away. "Ma'am, please step back. The police are on their way to handle this situation." Marcus could have left. He could have walked away from his cart full of groceries and driven home in his Tesla, but something inside him had reached its limit. He thought about his two daughters, 12 and 14, and the world they were growing up in. He thought about his patients, the children of all races who trusted him with their lives. He thought about every time he'd swallowed his dignity and walked away from situations like this, and how nothing had changed. So he stood there, straight-backed and calm, his hospital ID still clipped to his shirt, and waited for the police to arrive. Around him, more phones had come out, more witnesses to what was unfolding in the pristine aisles of Riverside Market. Within minutes, 2 police cars pulled up outside, their lights flashing against the darkening evening sky. Through the store's large front windows, Marcus could see 4 officers approaching. This was the moment when these situations typically turn dangerous, when miscommunication and prejudice could transform a simple grocery trip into a tragedy. But something unexpected was happening in the store. The young woman who'd identified herself as a nurse had been joined by others, an elderly white couple who Marcus had treated their grandson, a Latino man whose sister had been Marcus's patient, a white teenager who'd been a volunteer in the pediatric ward. They formed a loose circle around him, not threatening but present, witnesses, protectors, community. As the automatic doors slid open and the officers entered, Marcus took a deep breath. He thought about all the times he'd stood in operating rooms, holding lives in his hands, remaining calm under the most intense pressure. This was different, but in some ways, it was the same. It was about standing his ground, maintaining his dignity, and showing his daughters that sometimes justice required courage and patience in equal measure. The first officer approached, taking in the scene, the half-scanned groceries, the cluster of supportive customers, Karen Matthews clutching Marcus's driver's license, and Marcus himself, still standing tall in his wrinkled dress shirt and hospital ID. Officer James Sullivan was a 20-year veteran of the Millbrook Heights Police Department. As he assessed the situation, his eyes lingered on Marcus's hospital ID, then shifted to the growing crowd of supporters, and finally to Karen Matthews's flushed face. "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp and observant. Before Karen could speak, a new voice cut through the tension. "I can tell you exactly what the problem is." The crowd parted to reveal Patricia Reynolds, a 65-year-old retired judge who served on the hospital board. She walked with a cane, but carried herself with unmistakable authority. "I've been watching this entire incident unfold, and I've seen a clear case of harassment and discrimination against one of our community's most respected physicians." Karen's grip on the driver's license tightened. "I was simply following store protocol." "Protocol?" Sarah, the cashier, suddenly found her voice. "Mrs. Matthews, I've worked here for 4 years, and I've never seen you demand ID verification from any other customer purchasing wine. Never mind calling the police on them." Officer Sullivan's partner, a younger officer named Rodriguez, had been quietly observing the security footage on the store's mounted displays. He leaned over and whispered something in Sullivan's ear. "Mrs. Matthews," Officer Sullivan said, "could you please explain why you felt it necessary to call emergency services? Dr. Johnson has provided valid identification, and multiple witnesses can verify his identity." "You don't understand," Karen insisted, her voice rising. "He could be anyone. That ID could be fake. That hospital badge could be stolen. We've had problems with certain people trying to—" "Certain people?" The words came from Derek Foster, the store owner's son, who had just rushed in after receiving multiple texts about the situation. He was a 30-something man in a designer suit, clearly having left some other engagement to handle this crisis. "Karen, what exactly do you mean by certain people?" The fluorescent lights hummed in the uncomfortable silence that followed. Marcus remained still, his expression composed, but his eyes never leaving Officer Sullivan's face. Years of handling critical situations in the OR had taught him the value of staying calm when others lost their composure. "Perhaps," Marcus finally said, his voice carrying the same gentle authority he used when explaining complicated procedures to frightened parents, "we should discuss why Mrs. Matthews felt threatened by my presence despite my being a regular customer here for over a decade." A teenage girl near the back of the crowd raised her phone higher. "This is already going viral," she announced. "The hashtag Yasha Riverside Market is trending locally, and people are sharing their own stories about Mrs. Matthews." Derek Foster's face paled as he checked his own phone. The store's social media mentions were exploding, and early news vans were already pulling into the parking lot. What had started as one manager's discriminatory actions was rapidly becoming a moment of reckoning for the entire community. But something unexpected was happening among the gathered crowd. An elderly white woman stepped forward, tears in her eyes. "Dr. Johnson saved my great-granddaughter last year," she said, her voice trembling. "When everyone else said it was hopeless, he spent 18 hours in surgery and gave her back to us." Others began sharing their stories: nurses who'd worked with him, parents whose children he'd treated, colleagues who'd known him for years. Each testimony built upon the last, creating a powerful narrative that stood in stark contrast to Karen's suspicions. Officer Sullivan listened to each account, his expression thoughtful. He'd been on the force long enough to recognize watershed moments when he saw them. This wasn't just about one incident in a grocery store. It was about patterns of behavior that had gone unchallenged for too long. Karen Matthews' composure began to crack as she realized the gravity of her situation. Her hands shook as she still clutched Marcus's driver's license, as if it were both a shield and evidence of her righteousness. But her position was becoming increasingly untenable with each passing moment. Derek Foster stepped closer to Marcus, his face a mask of professional concern and genuine distress. "Dr. Johnson, I want to personally apologize for—" But Marcus raised a hand to pause him. "Mr. Foster, with all due respect, I'm not interested in a private apology or a quiet resolution. What happened here tonight isn't unique, it's not isolated, and it won't be solved with hushed conversations and hasty settlements." The automatic doors slid open again as more people entered the store, community leaders who'd received texts and calls about what was happening. Among them was City Council member Diana Chen, who had been advocating for mandatory bias training in local businesses. The story was growing beyond the confines of Riverside Market's walls, transforming into something larger than a single incident of discrimination. It was becoming a mirror in which the community was forced to see itself, to confront the uncomfortable truths that lurked beneath its polished surface. Through it all, Marcus's groceries sat half-scanned on the conveyor belt, the frozen items beginning to thaw, a mundane detail that somehow underscored the absurdity of the situation. A respected surgeon, a pillar of the community, prevented from completing the simple task of buying food for his family because of one person's prejudice. But this story wasn't heading toward a simple resolution of Karen being fired and Marcus receiving apologies. The momentum building in that store, the energy of the gathered crowd, the presence of community leaders, and the viral spread of the incident all pointed towards something more significant, something that could potentially transform not just one store's policies or one manager's behavior, but the deeper currents of bias that ran through the entire community. The next person to enter the store caused Marcus's carefully maintained composure to waver slightly. Dr. Rachel Johnson, his wife, and the head of neurology at Central Memorial strode through the automatic doors with their two daughters, Sophia and Maya, behind her. Someone in the crowd must have contacted her. Rachel's expression was a storm barely contained. As a black woman who had climbed to the top of her own medical field, she understood all too well what her husband was experiencing. But it was the presence of their daughters that added another layer of weight to the moment. Sophia, 14, and Maya, 12, stood wide-eyed, watching their father stand dignified amid the chaos, seeing firsthand the reality their parents had tried to prepare them for, while simultaneously trying to protect them from it. "Dad," Maya's voice was small, but carried in the tense quiet that had fallen over the store. "Are you in trouble?" Before Marcus could respond, Karen Matthews made perhaps her worst decision of the evening. "This is a private business matter," she snapped at the young girl. "Your presence here is not appropriate." Rachel Johnson stepped forward, her professional demeanor masking the fury beneath. "Mrs. Matthews, I assure you that my daughter's presence here is entirely appropriate. They need to witness both the injustice and the response to it. This is their education." City Council member Diana Chen had been in quiet discussion with Derek Foster and Officer Sullivan. Now she stepped into the center of the scene. "Mr. Foster, I believe we need to address this situation on multiple levels. This isn't just about one incident or one employee. This is a symptom of a deeper problem." Derek Foster nodded, looking increasingly uncomfortable as he glanced between his phone, where social media continued to explode, and the growing crowd in his store. Local news reporters were setting up cameras outside, their lights visible through the windows. "Perhaps," Marcus finally said, his voice steady but tired, "we should discuss why Mrs. Matthews felt so threatened by my presence that she needed to call the police, but she doesn't seem concerned about the actual disruption to business being caused by her actions." Karen flinched at his words, still holding his driver's license like a talisman. Officer Rodriguez had moved closer to her, his expression making it clear that she needed to return the ID immediately. But Karen wasn't finished. "You don't understand," she insisted, her voice rising with hysteria. "I was protecting the store. We've had incidents—" "What incidents?" Sarah the cashier interrupted. "I've worked every shift with you for 4 years, Mrs. Matthews. The only incidents I've seen are the ones you've created." A middle-aged black woman in the crowd stepped forward. 3 months ago, she followed my teenage son around the store until he left without buying anything. He was wearing his private school uniform and just wanted to buy a sports drink after soccer practice. More voices joined in, each with their own story. What had started as one incident was unveiling a pattern that could no longer be ignored or dismissed. Derek Foster's face grew increasingly ashen as he realized the full scope of what had been happening in his family's store. Sophia Johnson, watching everything unfold, pulled out her phone and started typing rapidly. "Dad," she said, her voice stronger than her sister's had been, "I'm looking at the store's reviews online. There are dozens of similar complaints about Mrs. Matthews going back months, but they're all buried under 5-star reviews about the store's organic selection and premium products." Diana Chen nodded grimly. "This is exactly what we've been trying to address in council meetings. Discrimination doesn't always come with obvious signs and slurs. Sometimes it wears a manager's badge and hides behind words like protocol and security." Officer Sullivan, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke again. "Mrs. Matthews, I need you to return Dr. Johnson's license to him immediately. Then we need to discuss the potential legal implications of making a false police report and your harassment of customers." The moment Sullivan mentioned legal implications, Karen's demeanor changed. The color drained from her face as she seemed to finally grasp the severity of her situation. Her hand trembling, she extended the license toward Marcus, but Rachel stepped forward and took it instead, passing it to her husband, with a look that spoke volumes about their shared experiences and battles. Derek Foster cleared his throat. "Dr. Johnson, I want to—" "Mr. Foster," Marcus interrupted, his voice firm but not unkind. "I appreciate that you want to apologize and resolve the situation quickly, but I think we've moved beyond simple apologies. My daughters are watching. Every young person in this crowd is watching. The whole community is watching through those phones. They need to see what real accountability and change look like." Diana Chen stepped forward again. "I have a proposal," she said, looking between Marcus, Derek Foster, and the assembled crowd. "One that might help transform this moment of crisis into an opportunity for real change." Diana Chen's proposal hung in the air for a moment as all eyes turned to her. The City Council has been working on a comprehensive anti-discrimination initiative for local businesses. Riverside Market could become our pilot program. Karen Matthews made a choked sound of protest, but Derek Foster raised his hand to silence her. "Please continue, Councilmember Chen." "We're proposing mandatory bias training, yes, but that's just the beginning," Diana explained. "We want to create community oversight boards for major businesses, regular cultural competency assessments, and clear reporting mechanisms for incidents of discrimination. But most importantly, we want to ensure that businesses reflect the diversity of our community, not just in their customer base, but in their leadership." Rachel Johnson stepped forward, her professional demeanor temporarily giving way to passionate advocacy. "And who would oversee these changes? Who would ensure they're more than just performative gestures?" "That's where we need community leaders like you and Dr. Johnson," Diana replied. "We need people who understand both the problem and the potential solutions, people who can bridge divides." Meanwhile, Maya had wandered over to Sarah, the cashier, who was still standing at her register, the half-scanned groceries a silent testament to how quickly an ordinary evening had transformed into something historic. "Does this happen a lot?" Maya asked quietly, but in the tension-filled store, her voice carried. "Do people treat others badly because of how they look?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "More than they should, honey, but maybe less after tonight." The gathered crowd had grown larger as word spread through social media and text messages. Among the new arrivals was Dr. James Chen, no relation to the council member, the hospital's chief of staff, who made his way through the crowd to stand beside Marcus. "I received several calls about this situation," he announced, his voice carrying authority. "Our hospital has been working to address systemic bias in healthcare. Perhaps it's time we extended those efforts into our broader community." Karen Matthews had backed herself into a corner, literally and figuratively, still clutching her walkie-talkie like a lifeline. Officer Rodriguez approached her again. "Ma'am, we need to take your statement about the events that led to your 911 call." "I was just doing my job," she whispered, but the defense sounded hollow, even to her own ears. Sophia, who had been quiet for a while, suddenly spoke up. "No, you weren't," she said, her teenage voice clear and unwavering. "Your job was to manage a store, not to judge people. I'm 14, and even I know the difference." Derek Foster had been in intense conversation with his legal team via phone. He ended the call and addressed the crowd. "Effective immediately, Mrs. Matthews is suspended pending a full investigation of all complaints against her. But that's just the start. Councilmember Chen, I want Riverside Market to be not just your pilot program, but your gold standard." Marcus, who had remained remarkably composed throughout the entire ordeal, finally moved from his spot near the register. "Mr. Foster, that's a commendable first step. But I think we need to acknowledge something important here. This isn't about one store or one manager. This is about the dozens of times my wife and I have experienced similar treatment, but didn't have a crowd of witnesses. This is about what our daughters will face as they grow up. This is about every person who left this store feeling humiliated, but didn't have a medical degree and community standing to protect them." Rachel placed a hand on her husband's arm, a gesture of support and shared understanding. She turned to address Karen directly. "Mrs. Matthews, I have to ask, what did you think would happen here tonight? What was your best-case scenario when you called the police on a well-known member of this community?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Karen's face went through a series of emotions: defensiveness, fear, confusion, and finally, something that might have been the beginning of understanding. Diana Chen seized the moment. "This is exactly why we need structured change. Bias isn't always conscious. Sometimes it's buried so deep, people don't even recognize it in themselves. But its impact is very real and very harmful." Officer Sullivan, who had been taking notes throughout the encounter, stepped forward. "Dr. Johnson, would you be willing to file a formal complaint? It would help establish a record and could be valuable in implementing these proposed changes." Before Marcus could respond, a new voice rang out from the crowd. An elderly black man, leaning on a cane, made his way forward. Everyone recognized Mr. Thompson, who had owned the local barbershop for over 50 years. "Young man," he addressed Marcus, though his eyes swept over the crowd. "What happened to you tonight isn't new, but how we're dealing with it, that's different. When I opened my shop in 1973, there wasn't anyone to witness these things, no phones to record it, no council members proposing changes. Maybe tonight can be more than just another incident. Maybe tonight can be the start of something." Mr. Thompson's words resonated through the store, carrying the weight of decades of similar experiences. Marcus found himself thinking about all the times he'd chosen silence over confrontation, weighing each potential incident against the energy it would cost, the time it would take, the emotional toll it would exact. "You're right, Mr. Thompson," Marcus said, "but change requires more than just witnesses. It requires action." He turned to Derek Foster. "Your store has been my family's primary grocery store for years. We've spent thousands of dollars here. How many other families have quietly taken their business elsewhere because of experiences like this? How many people have suffered in silence?" As if in response to his questions, a young woman in a hijab stepped forward from the crowd. "Last month, Mrs. Matthews followed me around the store and then insisted on searching my bag before I could leave. I had receipts for everything, but she said it was store policy. I never came back until today, when I saw what was happening on social media. I couldn't stay away. I had to witness this." Derek Foster looked increasingly uncomfortable as more stories emerged. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing with notifications. The incident had gone viral, with national news outlets picking up the story. Riverside Market was trending nationwide, and people were sharing similar experiences from stores across the country. We need concrete actions, Diana Chin insisted, not just words. Mr. Foster, are you prepared to make real changes? Because the council is prepared to use this incident as a catalyst for citywide reform. Before Foster could respond, Sophia Johnson raised her hand, still holding her phone. I've been reading the comments on social media, she said. People are organizing a boycott unless the store commits to specific changes. They're calling for a complete overhaul of hiring practices, management training, and community engagement. Karen Matthews, who had been quietly conferring with Officer Rodriguez, suddenly burst out. You're destroying everything. I was protecting the store. Our profits? Our profits? Sarah the cashier interrupted. The store's profits have been built on the loyalty of customers like Dr. Johnson and his family. Customers you've been harassing and driving away. I've watched you target people for years, and I'm ashamed I didn't speak up sooner. Rachel Johnson, who had been relatively quiet, stepped forward. My husband and I have spent our careers healing people, regardless of their race, religion, or background. We've saved lives in emergency rooms without stopping to check the patient's skin color or social status. Yet, when we leave the hospital, we face people like you, Mrs. Matthews, who see only what they fear. Maya, who had been watching everything with wide eyes, tugged at her father's sleeve. Dad, remember when you told me that sometimes the hardest patients to heal are the ones who don't know they're sick? A murmur of appreciation ran through the crowd at the young girl's insight. Marcus squeezed his daughter's shoulder, pride mixing with sadness that she had to learn these lessons so young. Diana Chen seized the moment. Mr. Foster, I'm prepared to present an emergency proposal to the City Council tomorrow morning. We need Riverside Market to commit to being part of the solution. That means immediate action, not just promises. Derek Foster looked around the store, at his suspended manager, at the Johnson family, at his employees, at the diverse crowd of community members all watching and waiting. He seemed to come to a decision. Councilmember Chen, Dr. Johnson, everyone, I want to propose something more than just policy changes. I want to establish a community advisory board with real power, not just oversight. I want to create a scholarship program for minority business management students. I want to transform our hiring practices from the ground up. He paused, looking directly at Marcus and Rachel. And I want your help to do it right. Officer Sullivan, who had been quietly observing, stepped forward. Mr. Foster, that's commendable, but we still need to address the legal implications of tonight's events. Making false police reports is a serious offense. Karen Matthews seemed to shrink further into herself as the officer spoke, but then something unexpected happened. She straightened up, her face showing conflict, and what might have been the first glimpse of real self-reflection. I need to say something, she began, her voice shaking. I've worked in retail for 25 years. I've always told myself I was doing my job, protecting the store. But tonight, seeing everyone here, hearing these stories, I've been forcing people to prove their right to exist in spaces that should have been welcoming to everyone. The store fell silent, waiting to see where this moment of apparent awareness might lead. Maya, wise beyond her years, whispered loud enough for many to hear. Is this what you call a teachable moment, Mom? Rachel smiled sadly at her daughter, but before she could respond, Mr. Thompson spoke again, his voice carrying decades of experience with both injustice and hope. Young lady, Mr. Thompson addressed Maya, though his eyes remained fixed on Karen Matthews. This is indeed a teachable moment, but the real question is, who's ready to learn? He adjusted his grip on his cane and continued. I've been in this town long enough to see promises made and broken, committees formed and forgotten. What matters isn't what we say tonight. It's what we do tomorrow, and the day after, and every day that follows. The automatic doors slid open again, admitting a tall woman in a crisp suit who immediately commanded attention. I'm Patricia Harris, from the State Attorney General's Civil Rights Division, she announced. We've been monitoring the social media coverage of this incident, and I'm here to ensure that any resolution includes measurable accountability. Karen Matthews paled further, but Patricia raised a hand. Mrs. Matthews, while your actions tonight were discriminatory and potentially criminal, you've demonstrated something rare, a willingness to acknowledge your biases. That doesn't excuse your behavior, but it might offer an opportunity. Diana Chin stepped forward eagerly. Ms. Harris, I've been proposing a pilot program that would... I'm aware of your proposal, Councilmember Chen, Patricia interrupted smoothly. In fact, I think tonight's incident might provide the perfect framework for a larger initiative. Mr. Foster, your store could become a case study in corporate transformation. Derek Foster nodded rapidly, but Marcus cleared his throat. With all due respect, he said, I'm concerned that we're moving too quickly toward institutional solutions while losing sight of the human cost. My daughters are watching this unfold. What message are we sending them about justice and accountability? Sophia, who had been unusually quiet, spoke up. Dad, I've been reading comments from other kids my age. They're sharing their own stories about Mrs. Matthews, about other stores, about feeling unwelcome in their own community. Maybe the message isn't just about justice. Maybe it's about change. Rachel wrapped an arm around her daughter's shoulders, but her attention was on Karen Matthews. Mrs. Matthews, my daughter Maya asked earlier if you were getting my husband in trouble. I'd like you to answer her now. Help her understand what happened here tonight. The store fell silent as Karen Matthews faced Maya Johnson. The security cameras continued to record. Phones remained raised, but this moment felt intensely personal. Karen's hands trembled as she clasped them together. She began, then stopped, seeming to really look at Maya for the first time. I made assumptions about your father because of how he looks. I've been making assumptions about people for years, telling myself I was doing my job, protecting the store. But tonight, seeing you here, seeing how my actions affected not just your father, but your whole family, I understand now that I wasn't protecting anything. I was causing harm. Maya considered this carefully. But why did you think Dad was dangerous? He's a doctor. He saves kids' lives. The simplicity of the question seemed to hit Karen harder than any of the legal threats or public shame. Tears welled in her eyes, but before she could respond, Officer Sullivan stepped forward. That's a question a lot of people need to answer, young lady, he said, including some of us in law enforcement. Patricia Harris was taking notes. This interaction should be part of our training materials. Mrs. Matthews, would you be willing to participate in a program that— Wait, interrupted Sarah, the cashier. Before we talk about programs and training, can we address something basic? Dr. Johnson's groceries are still sitting here, some of them defrosting. He still hasn't been allowed to complete his purchase. The mundane observation somehow crystallized the absurdity of the entire situation. A respected surgeon, trying to buy groceries for his family after saving a child's life, had been treated like a criminal, sparking a civil rights investigation and community uprising, all while his frozen goods melted on the conveyor belt. Mr. Thompson laughed, a sound both bitter and hopeful. You want to talk about progress? In my day, we couldn't even enter stores like this. Now we're standing here with the State Attorney General's office, city council members, and police officers discussing transformation. But that young lady is right. First, let the man buy his groceries. Marcus looked at his cart, then at his wife and daughters, then at the assembled crowd of supporters and officials. Something occurred to him, something that might bridge the gap between personal accountability and institutional change. Actually, Marcus said, his voice carrying the same calm authority he used in the operating room, I don't want to complete this purchase. Not yet. Mr. Foster, I have a proposal. Derek Foster, who had been in hushed conversation with Patricia Harris, turned his full attention to Marcus. Of course, Dr. Johnson. These groceries, Marcus gestured to the half-scanned items, represent more than just a transaction. They represent access, respect, and dignity. I propose we use them differently. Sarah, could you scan everything and calculate the total? Sarah quickly finished scanning the items. The total is $247.83, Dr. Johnson. Perfect, Marcus continued. Mr. Foster, I suggest we take this amount and multiply it by every week I've shopped here over the past 12 years. That money should form the foundation of a community fund, not just for diversity training, but for real economic empowerment. Rachel's eyes lit up, immediately understanding her husband's vision. A fund to support minority-owned businesses in the community, perhaps. To ensure that people have alternatives when they face discrimination. Diana Chen was already calculating on her phone. 12 years of weekly shopping, that would create a substantial initial investment. The city could match it as part of our new initiative. Karen Matthews, who had been silent since her interaction with Maya, suddenly spoke. I want to contribute too. My salary isn't much, but— No, Marcus interrupted, not unkindly. This isn't about personal punishment, Mrs. Matthews. It's about systemic change. Instead of contributing money, I want you to contribute time, real time, not just attending sensitivity training, but working with the communities you've harmed. Patricia Harris was taking notes rapidly. Dr. Johnson, this could be a model for restorative justice in retail discrimination cases. Would you be willing to— She was interrupted by Maya tugging on her father's sleeve again. Dad, what about tonight's groceries? We still need dinner. The simple observation from his youngest daughter made Marcus smile. You're right, sweetheart. And that brings me to the second part of my proposal. He turned to address the crowd. Every person here tonight witnessed something important, but witnessing isn't enough. I want to invite everyone here to shop together, right now. Fill your carts, talk to each other, share stories. Show that this space belongs to all of us. Mr. Thompson chuckled. A midnight shopping party as civil rights activism? Now I've seen everything. But people were already moving, grabbing carts and baskets. The young woman in the hijab, who had shared her story earlier, found herself discussing halal options with an elderly Jewish couple. A group of teenagers who had been recording everything on their phones started asking Sarah questions about working retail and dealing with discrimination. Derek Foster, watching this spontaneous community building, made a quick decision. Everything purchased in the next hour is 50% off, he announced, and will match the discount amount as an additional contribution to Dr. Johnson's community fund. Officer Sullivan and his partner exchanged glances. We should probably stay, Sullivan said, to document everything for the Civil Rights Division, and maybe do a little shopping ourselves. Patricia Harris smiled. I'll need to recuse myself from any purchases since this is now an official investigation, but I'm staying to observe. This is unprecedented. As people dispersed through the aisles, Marcus finally turned his full attention to his family. Girls, why don't you help your mother pick out some fresh groceries? I need a moment with Mrs. Matthews. Karen, who had been standing uncertainly near her office door, straightened as Marcus approached. The store cameras were still recording. Phones were still filming, but this conversation felt private despite the public setting. Mrs. Matthews, Marcus began, I want to tell you about a surgery I performed today. Today, I operated on an 8-year-old boy named Tommy, Marcus continued, his voice gentle but firm. He had a congenital heart defect that everyone said was inoperable. His parents were told to prepare for the worst. But when I looked at Tommy, I didn't see a hopeless case. I saw a child who deserved every chance at life. Karen listened, tears forming in her eyes as Marcus spoke. For 12 hours, I stood in that operating room, making hundreds of minute decisions that would determine whether that boy lived or died. At no point did anyone question my right to be there, my credentials, or my intentions. Because in that operating room, I wasn't a black man. I was simply a surgeon fighting to save a life. He paused, letting the words sink in. But the moment I walked into your store, none of that mattered. You didn't see a doctor, a father, or even a regular customer. You saw a threat, and that, Mrs. Matthews, is why we're here tonight. Around them, the store had transformed. Customers of all backgrounds were shopping together, sharing stories, and building connections. Sophia and Maya were helping an elderly white couple reach items on high shelves. Rachel was in deep conversation with Diana Chen and Patricia Harris about specific metrics for measuring the success of their new initiatives. The surgery succeeded, Marcus continued. Tommy will live a full life, but when his parents thanked me, they didn't see color either. They saw the person who saved their child. That's the world I want my daughters to live in, Mrs. Matthews. Not one where they're judged by their appearance, but by their actions and character. Karen wiped her eyes. I understand now, or at least I'm beginning to. What happens next? Marcus gestured to the store around them. This happens next. Real change, not just tonight, but every day. You'll work with the Community Oversight Board. You'll share your story, not as a villain, but as someone who recognized their biases and chose to change. And most importantly, you'll learn to see people as people. Derek Foster approached them, holding several documents. Dr. Johnson, we've drafted the initial proposal for the community fund. The board has already approved an initial contribution of $1 million. Good, Marcus nodded. But remember, this isn't about money. It's about transformation. Every person who shops here should feel valued, respected, and safe. The impromptu shopping party was winding down. As people checked out, they exchanged phone numbers and social media contacts, planning future meetings and community events. Officer Sullivan had his notebook full of statements, and Patricia Harris had enough material for a groundbreaking civil rights initiative. Mr. Thompson made his way back to Marcus, leaning on his cane. "You know, young man, I've been fighting for change for over 60 years. Sometimes it comes in big waves, like court decisions and protest marches. But sometimes it comes in smaller moments, like tonight, when one person stands their ground and helps others see the truth." Marcus gathered his family, Rachel, Sophia, and Maya, around him. Their new groceries were bagged and ready, but they had gained something far more valuable than food. They had witnessed a community coming together, confronting uncomfortable truths and choosing to change. "Dad," Sophia said as they finally headed toward the exit, "I think I want to be a civil rights lawyer instead of a doctor." Marcus laughed. "Whatever you choose to be, honey, just remember what you saw tonight. Change is possible when people stand up for what's right, when they refuse to let fear and prejudice win, and when they work together to build something better." As they walked to their car, the lights of the news vans still flashing in the parking lot, Maya asked one final question. "Did we restore their faith in justice, Dad?" Marcus looked back at the store, where people were still talking, planning, and connecting. Karen Matthews was in deep conversation with Patricia Harris about her role in the new training programs. Derek Foster was on the phone with his corporate office, explaining the sweeping changes coming to all their locations. Diana Chen was scheduling an emergency city council meeting to fast-track the new initiatives. "No, sweetheart," he replied, squeezing her hand. "We did something better. We showed them how to build justice. One moment, one person, one change at a time." The automatic doors closed behind the Johnson family, but the impact of that night would ripple through their community for years to come. The hashtag Just Riverside Market would evolve from a symbol of discrimination to a beacon of transformation, inspiring similar changes across the country. And in a small suburban grocery store, people of all backgrounds would shop together, remembering the night when one man's dignity, one family's strength, and one community's conscience helped bend the arc of history a little closer toward justice. Mr. Thompson's words would be inscribed on a plaque near the store's entrance. "Change begins when we see each other as human beings, all deserving of respect, dignity, and the simple right to buy groceries in peace." And that was just the beginning.